Please welcome in full fettle and full uniform, Clay Shelley.
Thank you, Don. It's a privilege to be here today. I haven't been down in this area for several years, and driving down here, it reminds me how beautiful this country really is. So we're going to be talking today a little bit about the history of Camp Floyd and why it was important to Utah's history and how it is still important to Utah's history today. So, in 1856, Judge Drummond was assigned to come out here to the Utah Territory, and he didn't like it out here too much. He was in Fillmore. What was interesting about Judge Drummond is he had left his wife and his kids back home and brought his mistress with him. And so that wasn't taken too kindly by the people here in Utah. And he got a little upset and was disgraced a little bit. And so he fled Utah Territory, went to New Orleans, and sent a letter of resignation to President Buchanan in Washington, D.C. And in that letter, he outlined serious accusations about Brigham Young and the people in Utah. Accusations that proved to be false, but just like history today, we never overreact, really, no? And President Buchanan overreacted, and he ended up sending 1/3 of the entire United States Army to Utah to put down the rebellion that Judge Drummond had said was going on. So in 1857, the soldiers started marching from all over the country. There weren't a lot of full-time soldiers at the time. Most territories or states had militias. And so they were pulling soldiers from all over the United States. They even had signs up for when the immigrants entered into New York City, there would be a sign saying, "Join the Army, explore the West, get an education, fight the Mormons." And some of the people that actually signed up thought that the Mormons must be one of them Indian groups that they had heard of in the West, and they were going to go put down those rebellious Indians. And some of them were a little bit frustrated when they found out that many of the people they were going to fight were from their same home areas in Europe that had come here to Utah. So they started marching to put down this supposed rebellion. And imagine living in the Salt Lake Valley. And we know on July 24th, 1847, when Brigham Young came into the Salt Lake Valley, he was laying in the back of his wagon sick, and he leaned up, sat up, looked around, said, "This is the right place, move on." And so he gave a promise that if the pioneers living in the Salt Lake Valley at that time were able to live for 10 years in peace, that the people would prosper. And so on July 24th, 1857, they were up Big Cottonwood Canyon celebrating the 10-year anniversary of coming into the Salt Lake Valley when the riders came in to inform them that the Army was on its way to wipe them out. They were enjoying this big celebration. Brigham Young called together the leaders and decided to call up the militia, 5,000 strong, under the direction of General Daniel H. Wells. And so they did not know what way the army was going to come or how quick they were going to come. And so they started to fortify all entrances into the Salt Lake Valley. So in these pictures here, we see some of the fortifications. On the top one on the left side, you can see the stacked rocks up on the very top of that cliff. On the bottom one, which is in East Canyon State Park, you can see the pile of rocks, what's left of one of the fortifications there. So what the militia did was there's a choke point on I-80, I-84 there in Echo Canyon, and they built dams, built booby traps basically, so if the wagons, the army, the teams, the cannons were coming through, they would be slowed down and stopped. And then they built these fortifications, because just like down here in this beautiful valley, when you look at the cliffs, it's nice and flat on top, and you're straight up on the bottom. So you might take you a while to get around on the bottom, but up on top, it's flat. And they could move from fortification to fortification. And the goal was to fool the army into thinking that there were thousands and thousands of soldiers there. So when the Army got into what we refer to as Wyoming now, which was part of the Utah Territory at the time, gentlemen by the name, like Porter Rockwell and Lot Smith, had gone out with their guerrilla warfare, their militia guys, and they had burned grass. Porter bragged that he had chased off all the government cattle. So they burned the grass, chased off all the cattle, and slowed the army down enough that winter came. When they got to the location of Fort Bridger was a fort that was owned by the Mormon Church, and it, along with Fort Supply 20 miles south, Brigham Young ordered them to be burned to the ground. They were stations for the pioneers as they came west to resupply, to continue their path into the Salt Lake Valley. Fort Supply, the records show that it took over 3 days to burn to the ground with all the food and supplies that were inside that. But they did not want the army to get a hold of those supplies to keep their push into the Salt Lake Valley. So because Fort Bridger being burned to the ground, Camp Scott was made just 3 miles south. It's in a little cove. And luckily for us today, historically, it's been in private hands the whole time, and most of it has not been farmed. And so to get permission to go on there, which I was able to do a few years ago, you could actually see the circled rocks where the Sibley tents once stood. They found a lot of the foundation of the different tents and that. On the south side of the stream that flowed through the little cove was the army. On the north side of the stream was the civilians. So that was all the Teamsters, Governor Alfred Cummings, who was the incoming governor that the Army was bringing to replace Brigham Young. All of his officials, the judges, were all on the north side of the stream. The north side has been plowed and farmed, so there's nothing really left there. But it's cool to see some of the stuff on the south side. So because the Army was stopped there in November of 1857, they didn't have any supplies. So some of the soldiers had to go out and try to find food, hunt game, do different things to be able to get through the winter. They could no longer approach Salt Lake City because the snow was deep enough that they were basically shut down. So this time, General Johnston had asked Captain Randolph Marcy to go to the nearest military base, which was in Fort Massachusetts, New Mexico Territory. So he grabbed some of his men, and he started heading south. And going through Colorado Territory, and of course being November, we all know what the snow's like in the Rockies in that area. They went south. And if it wasn't for men that were hired to guide them down, like Mariana Medina and Miguel Alona, they would have all died on that way down there. When they got down to the mountains, when they were on the north side of the Fort Massachusetts area, there was one pass that they could get through. And both men thought they knew how to get there because they had traveled through there years before. But Mariana Medina was sure he knew the way, and they made it through the pass and got down close to where Fort Massachusetts was. By then, all of their supplies were gone. All their animals were basically dead that they had left trying to get down there. So those two men took what supplies they could and trekked out on their own and made it to Fort Massachusetts to get the soldiers to come back out and save the Marcy's party and bring them into Fort Massachusetts. So they resupplied food, mules, teams, and they had to wait a little bit for it to clear up, and they headed back north. Connected back up with the trail, and headed back to Camp Scott. So they resupplied the army so they could march into Salt Lake Valley. But there was one problem while they were doing this. Colonel Thomas L. Kane. Colonel Kane was a gentleman that tried to help anybody that he thought was bullied. And he went to President Buchanan and he said, "Send me west. I will broker peace." President Buchanan told him, "No, we will not authorize you to go west. If you want to do it on your own, you are welcome to." So he got on a boat in New York, sailed all the way to Panama, went across Panama, got on a second boat, went up to San Francisco. At this time, people knew that he was coming and what he was trying to do, and he went under disguise, basically using a false identity so that he wouldn't be stopped. Made it to Salt Lake City in February of 1858, met with Brigham Young, was welcomed, and they had a nice conversation, and he decided, "I'm going to head on up to Camp Scott, and I'm going to talk to General Johnston and Alfred Cummings." So he made it up to Camp Scott. Alfred Cummings was willing to go to Salt Lake City. They asked General Johnston for a group of soldiers to protect them on the way down. And General Johnston said no. And so they ended up going on their own to Salt Lake City. But we saw the pictures of the fortifications when Governor Cummings was going in on his wagon through Echo Canyon, through those 5,000 strong soldiers, or the militia there, in what's referred to as Wickiup City, where they were all camped while they were making those fortifications. Those militia guys actually stood up and saluted Governor Cummings coming in because they recognized him as the incoming governor. They recognized him as the person that was going to replace Brigham Young. So in June of 1857, their peace commission arrives in Salt Lake City with the proclamation of pardon for the rebellion that never happened. And so peace was brokered. The agreement was made that the army would not be anywhere closer than 50 miles from Salt Lake City. It didn't matter where. It didn't matter which direction. They just had to be at least 50 miles from Salt Lake City. So in June of 1857, the Army marched out of Immigration Canyon. At this point, there was no longer just 1/3 of the entire United States Army. It went from 2,500 soldiers to 3,500 soldiers, because when they got stopped at Camp Scott, an additional 1,000 soldiers were called up and brought there to make sure that they could get through to Salt Lake City. So imagine them marching all the way through the Salt Lake Valley and still having the soldiers coming out of Immigration Canyon as they're coming across. They camped on the west side of the Jordan River, gathered all the soldiers there, and then moved along the Jordan River when they had decided where they were going to stay. And they moved to the Jordan, through the Jordan Narrows, and they went to a place that we refer to as Old Camp Floyd. The biggest problem that the soldiers had was the contention between the settlers and the army. You can imagine being someone living in Salt Lake Valley. You, yourself, or somebody you knew had been chased out of New York, had been chased out of Ohio, out of Missouri, out of Illinois, and now the army was on its way to basically chase you out and move you out of Salt Lake City, out of Utah. So they did not want the army right next to them. So they chose West Canyon, which is about 5 miles north of Cedar Fort, and they established the camp. They needed 3 things to establish a camp. You needed feed for your animals, water for your animals and yourselves, and you needed space to set up camp. They found that at Old Camp Floyd. And so they set up Here's a sketch from Captain Albert Tracy's journal of old Camp Floyd. They set up the camp there. They had a nice flowing stream coming down the canyon, plenty of water. They were set. They set their tents up. We all know how valuable water is in Utah. And we know usually by August, there's no water coming down the streams because all of our water is snow melt. So from June, having running water coming down the stream, to by August having no water at all coming down the stream, and then panicking and going, what are we doing with the 3,500 soldiers? We can't be here. Our animals are going to die. They decided to go to Fairfield, which was their first choice anyway, but because of that potential conflict between the settlers in Fairfield, which were right at the point of where Camp Floyd was going to be, they ended up going to the south side of the stream that flows from the big spring, natural spring that flows up out of the ground, flows about 3/4 of the mile through the Cedar Valley, and dissipates back in the ground in a spot called the Fairfield Sinks. They don't know for sure where the water comes from. In the past, they've actually put dye in the stream, and they don't know where the water goes once it goes back in the ground. But there was enough water there for the settlers of Fairfield and for the Army that this is an actual map that was drawn by the cartographer that was with Captain James Simpson of Camp Floyd, of everything that was there. They ended up building between 300 and 400 buildings. The largest military base in the United States. But coming to Utah and coming into the Cedar Valley, those that know the Cedar Valley know that there were no trees there historically, and they had to find building materials for Camp Floyd. And they ended up buying adobe bricks from the local settlers. The 1.6 million bricks were sold to the soldiers for a penny apiece. So you think about that for a minute. You have an army coming to wipe you out. Here in Utah, your economy was based on paper money that was backed by the cattle on Antelope Island, which was the church's first cattle farm for the LDS Church. It was the first ranch. So if you went outside of Utah territory, you no longer had anything of value because no one's going to accept that money because it's not backed by gold. It's not recognized anywhere but within Utah territory. So these soldiers are now buying bricks and using gold coins and using money recognized throughout the United States, helping the local economies. Here's a few pictures of Camp Floyd, historical pictures. Some of them are Captain Albert Tracy's drawings. Some of them are photographs. The soldiers being here in the largest base, there was not a war going on, so they had to find things to do. They had to find ways of keeping themselves busy. And so you see in some of the pictures we have inside a Sibley tent, soldiers sitting on their packs, talking and enjoying time. We've got other soldiers. This is down in Nephi, Fort Salt Creek, where they sent soldiers throughout the Utah territory to take care of making sure that peace was kept. And if that picture, about every one of them is smoking a pipe. People were so bored that we have found thousands and thousands of pieces of pipes. You have what is very cool is the color drawing of a rabbit hunt. Cedar Valley was known for its rabbit hunts clear up through the 1950s. I constantly have people come out there that say, yeah, I used to come out and hunt rabbits. There's not any rabbits anymore in the Cedar Valley. And it's because of these hunts. The soldiers at that time were doing it for food. They needed another option for supper instead of just their plain old stuff. But they had rabbit derbies where teams would come in and who could shoot the most rabbits at the time through the 1880s, 90s, early 1900s, all the time. One of the coolest pictures here is the Captain Albert Tracy's sketch of his quarters. What this sketch tells us is what gun he was using. You can see his sword on the wall. You can see that he has a dog. Even though dogs were not allowed on base, some of the officers were allowed to have them. So you can see a lot of, and these were the adobe buildings that they built and how nice they were. There were two types of buildings. You had the officer quarters. There's a couple pictures of the officer quarters there. You had the enlisted men's quarters, which were usually 6 rooms, 1 exterior room and 5 rooms. And we don't know for sure what the exterior room was used. It could have been where the laundress did laundry, because they did hire a lot of civilians to take care of the needs of the soldiers. But we're finding evidence and photographs and all this at Camp Floyd. And we can tell a lot about the uniforms and everything from these sketches, even though we may not have photographs of everything. Now, one thing that you do have when you have large groups of men is you have what are referred to as camp followers. And when you have camp followers, you have people coming and setting up businesses. Fairfield originally had 11 families that were assigned by Brigham Young to come out in 1855. The time of Camp Floyd, that population of that area soared to over 7,000 people, making it the 3rd largest city in Utah Territory. We've looked through newspaper articles and we've come across 55 advertised businesses in Fairfield that these soldiers could come over and spend money on. Even though we had companies like Waddell, Majors, and Russell, who not only started the Pony Express that went through Camp Floyd, the Central Overland Stage Company, but they also had the contract to haul supplies from St. Louis, Missouri, and later on from Sacramento, California, when the Army built what we refer to as the Pony Express Trail today. Captain Simpson, who Simpson Springs is named after, among other things that are named after the soldiers, Soldier Hollow and 5 Mile recreation area. Many people have heard of 5 Mile. They have no idea, recreating there, that it was named because of the soldiers. It was 5 miles from headquarters of Camp Floyd. A lot of those places named. But those soldiers influenced so much of the growth and the stability of the Utah Territory. And so these businesses came to take advantage of that in a lot of ways. So we had multiple hotels in Fairfield because of the visitors coming on stagecoaches from Salt Lake City and traveling to California on the Central Overland Stage. There were multiple stores. There was even a photography shop. Sad thing is, we cannot find a single photo of Fairfield, even though the photography shop advertises that tintypes are there for sale and that he will take pictures. He had a store in Salt Lake City, and this is a satellite store. So he wasn't here every day, but he was there in Fairfield enough that there should be a photograph of Fairfield somewhere. Now, because you have all these soldiers there, you also have brothels, saloons, and gambling halls. We have articles that talk about the drinks on the first floor and the ladies on the second floor. So we know that there were 2-story buildings there in Fairfield. We have other advertisements that say, come inside, meet the lady of your choice, and go out. There's tents behind where you can go. So we know that that was probably a one-story building. But we also have advertisements that talk about billiards upstairs. They had bowling. They had a horse track. They had a theater. One of the things that Brigham Young did to try to mend the relationships between the soldiers and the army, or the settlers, was he sent missionaries to Camp Floyd to perform. Missionaries that would have operas and theater and those things, because prior to that, most of the musicals or the theater and that were done by soldiers, and they were anti-Mormon in nature. And so Brigham Young wanted to change that a little bit. And so one of the stories is that one of his daughters came down to perform. And this is folklore. We haven't found it, but there's always a truth in folklore that we know. But the story is that she actually left her husband and ran off with a soldier. And so things like that were happening both ways there in Fairfield. Racetracks, we have stories of the racetrack was about a mile north of downtown Fairfield. If anybody has been out to Cedar Valley lately, there is a large development going on about 3 miles north of Fairfield called Firefly. And we're guessing right in that area is where the racetrack probably would have been. But now it's turning into like 9,000 houses. All right, come on, there we go. One of the things we know that the red light district of Fairfield was referred to as Frogtown. This is a drawing from one of the soldiers, so we do know the location of Frogtown. We know there were businesses scattered throughout all of what Fairfield is today, proper Fairfield, but we know where a lot of those saloons. We have one story of where Judge Eccles, who was the judge not even over the area of Fairfield, but he decided that he wanted to authorize the soldiers to vote. And so right next to the Stagecoach Inn or the Carson Inn, there was a place called Frogtown Saloon. And he authorized all of the soldiers, made them all eligible to vote in the election of 1859. They all marched into the building, which would have been one of probably the general stores, took a folded piece of paper, walked to the other side of the store, dropped it into the ballot box, walked out the store into the saloon right next door, which we're assuming was probably the Frogtown Saloon because it was right in that area, and got their free beer. There was a reporter there that wrote that the old guard could not get in to vote. So the military, the soldiers, basically had everything blocked until polls were closed so that they could change the way the votes were going in the area there of Cedar County. Luckily, all those votes were overturned because not only were soldiers not allowed to vote, but you can't be drunk while you vote. And so things like that were happening constantly in Fairfield. The soldiers of Fairfield, the Camp Floyd was the second healthiest military base in the United States at that time. The only one that was healthier than us was West Point. There were 35 burials in their cemetery. Many people remember years ago going to the cemetery and there being over 100 headstones. And they ask me today, well, what happened? Most of those, well, if you have 100 people buried there, and we did ground penetrating radar years ago, the state park system did, and we found 35 graves. Through research, we found that most of the soldiers that were listed as buried there were dying in other places. They had soldiers that died in Texas before their detachments left for the Utah theater. And you're not going to pack a body all the way to Utah to bury them. You're burying them where they die. And so they were able to narrow it down that there were 21 soldiers that died by disease. Some of those diseases were unknown diseases, but we know with what was going on in Fairfield a lot, you can probably guess what some of those diseases might have been. We have one drowning. There's a stream. And if people visit Camp Floyd today, you can hop that stream. But historically, that stream, by the looks of the bank, the cut of the bank, was probably about 20 feet wide. They had two bridges to get over from Fairfield to Camp Floyd. So this one drowning was most likely a soldier that had snuck off base into Fairfield, got a little tipsy, came back onto base sneaking in, probably slipped or fell, hit their head or something, slid under the water, and drowned. That's the only way you could think of why would they drown in that stream. 2 accidental shootings, 3 murders. Part of that contention between the soldiers and the settlers of Utah, you have Sergeant Pike, that the soldiers had given a person permission to run cattle over in Rush Valley. The word was coming back that those people, or the ranchers over there, were selling guns and alcohol to the natives over there. So the soldiers went to put a stop to it. And Sergeant Pike was standing there when somebody grabbed a pitchfork and started running towards the soldiers, and he hit him in the head with the butt of his gun. That person never recovered fully, had mental issues the rest of his life. Even though Utah was under military rule and it was justified self-defense, a warrant was issued for Sergeant Pike in Salt Lake City to go answer for the crime of attempted murder. General Johnston said, "You don't need to go." And he's like, "I'm going to go clear my name." So him and some of the other soldiers went to Salt Lake City. And the brother of the person that he had hit in the head saw him, pulled his revolver out and shot him. So you had the Valley Tan newspaper, which was pro-military, pro-Camp Floyd, says that he was assassinated in Salt Lake City. Because of that animosity between the soldiers and the settlers of Salt Lake City, they would not take Sergeant Pike to a doctor in Salt Lake City because in their eyes, they were untrained Mormon doctors. They didn't know what they were doing. They were no better than a horse doctor. So they loaded him on a wagon and tried to take him that 50 miles back out to Camp Floyd. And he died on the way. If they probably would have just let a doctor see him in Salt Lake City, he probably would have lived and been okay. We have 2 other murders that happened of soldiers that were found outside of Fairfield. No idea what happened to them other than they were shot. No idea who did it or why. Most likely they were over in Fairfield, got in a fight. Maybe they won a lot of money at a poker game and were sneaking back on base, and somebody came over and murdered them and took their money. We have no record for sure other than they were found the next morning by the guard of the base. We have 3 suicides and 5 unknowns. So there was a little bit going on at Camp Floyd, but it was pretty much a safe place for the soldiers to be. Just a lot of boredom and a lot of wondering what to do on their days off. Then you look at Fairfield. Fairfield was known as one of the wildest places in the Utah Territory. There was constantly gun violence. There's prostitution, gambling. There were shootouts on Main Street. There was theft and murders. that were happening almost daily. And so it had a reputation. So General Johnson didn't want his soldiers just going over there. They had to get their pass to leave the base. But many of them, well, you can only imagine if you were serving at Camp Floyd and your friend was on guard duty, marching back and forth because there were no walls around Camp Floyd, and you were sneaking across, he was going to let you, because if he wanted to go a couple days later, it might be you that's on guard duty. So you were letting each other get across because the officers wouldn't know that you were over there. So brothels were a big thing. Here's a few of the articles and different things about the brothels. You can imagine the poor Mormon community of Fairfield that was there prior to Camp Floyd. You have guys like John Carson, who was the presiding elder over the Mormon group of people there, trying to raise his kids and keeping them away from everything that was going on there in Fairfield. The racetrack. We had soldiers racing. We had civilians racing. And this in 1859, one of the Second Dragoons, because the Dragoons, unlike me, I'm wearing an infantry uniform. But the Dragoons were soldiers that fought on horses. So they had like an 1859 Sharps, which was a shorter musket or gun, which was a breech-loading gun that was on a pin. They could just swing it up and use it if they needed to. Well, they had some good horses, and this one really fine horse got beat by what they referred to as a plug. And they had champions that would cheer on and get the bets going for their jockeys, for their riders and their horses. And one of them got upset that he got beat by a plug, and the champion went over there, basically just walked over and stabbed the other guy in the heart and jumped on a horse and took off, never to be found, never to be caught again. So things like that were happening constantly. There wasn't really a jail, but there were people that were held in upstairs rooms of people's houses in Fairfield. So they would put a ball and chain them to a bed and have them up there. There was a brig there on the base, but it didn't hold a lot of people constantly. So the first counterfeiting ring in Utah Territory, somebody stole some plates, brought them to Camp Floyd, and were trying to recreate money. And so those types of things were happening there right next to where the soldiers were. And all right. This is hard to read up here, and I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about it. So in December of 1859, Governor Cummings was giving his State of the Territory address, and he basically mentioned two places, Salt Lake City and Fairfield, but we're just going to focus on the Fairfield. He basically had said to Congress, to the legislature, that Fairfield was such a horrible place because of the crime, the murders, the thievery, all the stuff going on there, that they needed to figure out one of two things. First thing is if the sheriff was not able to do his job, then they needed to replace that sheriff. The second part of that was, if the sheriff is doing all that he can to take care of the crime here, they needed to dig into the territorial coffers and give him the ability to do his job to clean up Fairfield. All of this stuff happening in Fairfield was only happening because the Army was there at Camp Floyd. If the Army wasn't there, there would still only been the 11 families in Fairfield. And so we have a lot of this stuff going on, and because of the Army being there. We've got cattle rustling, we've got horses being stolen from the base. So there was constantly people going and trying to find people that were breaking the law there. So one of the important things about the soldiers is they patrolled, because there was not a war, they patrolled all the way into Oregon Territory, Idaho Territory. They patrolled all the way through Utah Territory, and they also patrolled as far west as Carson Valley, Nevada. Their goal at that point were to send out sub-camps to protect those routes, especially the Pony Express, the stage lines, and the immigrant wagon trains. We do have one account of them being up in Idaho, and a wagon train destined for California was attacked. They grabbed all of those people, helped take care of the wounded, brought them all the way down to Camp Floyd, helped them get back on their feet, and continued them on the new trail. And so that's what they did for the 3 years that they were at Camp Floyd, is they helped build that economy, not only by buying supplies for building Camp Floyd, but if you are stuck eating salted pork or salted beef, a fresh apple pie is going to be a wonderful thing to eat. So they were buying these supplies locally from the people around Cedar Valley, the people in Lehigh, American Fork, Provo. They were buying fruits, vegetables, grain. And of course, one of the guys in charge of buying supplies was buying more than what the military needed and making all of his money off of that. And so in April of 1861, one of these famous Pony Express riders just came running into camp full speed on his horse. And typically he stopped and received a new mochila there, a block east of our museum there in Fairfield. But he didn't stop and switch horses. He just went right on to base. And he went to the administration office, and Colonel Philip St. George Cook was the last commandant of Camp Floyd at that time. And he informed him that Fort Sumter had been fired upon. They needed all of the soldiers to come back and fight the Civil War. But they knew that this was coming because family members were letting their loved ones there at Camp Floyd know what was going on. And when enlistments came up, those soldiers that had sympathies towards the southern states were already leaving Camp Floyd and going south to join the Confederacy. And so those that were remaining at Camp Floyd were a lot of the immigrants that didn't have a tie to the north or south. They had a tie to their paycheck. So they were given the order to dismantle Camp Floyd. You remember, about 400 buildings. So they held an auction, and $4 million worth of supplies were sold for $100,000. So not only were you selling supplies to the Army, but you're now buying supplies back from the Army that you originally sold to the Army, and then able to turn around and sell them again. You have companies like the Walker Brothers. In Salt Lake City, we have the Walker Building, which is remnants of their empire, the Walker Store and Bank. They got their start in Fairfield because they were the only ones, they started their store, but they were the only ones with a safe that hold money. So that's how they became in the banking industry. They were number 2 in the auction. Number 1 was Brigham Young, but they bought the second most supplies, and they were delivering those same supplies to the gold mines in Nevada and Montana and selling them all over for basically quadrupling their prices on it, because when you go into those mining camps, you're selling them for 100 times what they're worth somewhere else because of the demand and the need for them. So we know in July of 1861 that the soldiers left Camp Floyd and started heading back towards the East to fight the Civil War. And we know this because on July 15th, 1861, they had their last funeral for the last soldier that died. And the next day they started east. Now, there's a lot of folklore about what they actually took with them. We get a lot of people asking us, where are the cannons? We were told that they buried their cannons. Well, according to the quartermaster reports, all of the 6-pounders and all the 12-pounders went back. You needed those cannons to fight. You're not going to bury them. We do have 2 32-pound howitzers that do not list that they went back. So once again, there is a little truth in folklore, so maybe they did bury those cannons in the spring or in a well, as the folklore states, because they were so small and awkward trying to get them back. No, they didn't leave all the gold. They took all the gold coins with them because, once again, how are the soldiers going to fight if you're not going to pay them to fight? And we get that all the time. People wanting to come out and metal detect because they were told that all the gold coins that the Army had, they buried. No, they didn't bury those. The only thing we know that they did leave was we do have records of piles of lead that were melted, which would have been bullets. And so we do have records of some of the farmers reusing that lead and making tools or making bullets and stuff out of them. So that's the only thing we can substantiate and know for a fact that was left. So the soldiers all left, and you think, well, what happened to Camp Floyd? Well, the museum that we have now was purchased by the Birdsall family and used as a home. And luckily for us, we have the only building left from Camp Floyd's history, even though there's very little of that original building left, but we have that as in our park today. Then across the street, of course, we have the Stagecoach Inn. Those are the 2 buildings left from the time of Camp Floyd. The rest of the buildings were dismantled, and the lumber, the hardware, the nails, anything that was salvageable inside there, that's what they did, is they dismantled and sold all of that stuff. And then the adobe brick, which was the outer skirting of the buildings, basically all just disintegrated back into the ground. So at Camp Floyd, what do we do today? We want to tell the story of the soldiers. But the hard thing is we don't have any of those original buildings left. You know, you can go to Gettysburg and feel the reverence there and see the history there. And there are evidence of what happened there. You can go to a historical site. You know, one of my favorite sites I went to was Mount Vernon. To be able to go through Mount Vernon and know that George Washington lived here and this was his home. We don't have this at Camp Floyd. So how do we tell that story? We do it through our programs and through photographs and different things that we have. And so presentations like this, I can go in a little more depth on some of those, the history that I can't, because we are a small museum and we are a small staff museum. And so a lot of times when you come and visit, it's just welcome, thank you, here, watch this, go through here, go through that. Oh, the next group's here. And you don't have a lot of time to spend with our visitors. So we do day camps. We had 29 kids last week. 2 weeks ago, because we do every 2 weeks. So next week we get another day camp, another group of kids. So they get to become soldiers for 3 days and learn the history. Imagine coming out and working side by side, becoming friends with one of your soldiers, exploring, going prospecting, all the gold in Mercer, Ophir, all through Tooele County, all that gold and silver was found by prospecting soldiers because they needed something to do. And then suddenly, you're fighting on opposite sides of the Civil War. So we tell this story through our day camps and our school groups and our different things that we have going on. We do our history camps. We do an egg scramble. Yes, we do activities that may not have been historically there or may not be part of our mission. but we introduce a new group of people to what we are, so then they want to come back and see us for our history, even though they might have only been there for something. We have adventure camps where families, youth groups can come and spend the night in Sibley tents and learn about the soldiers and do those things, and we feed them breakfast on that Saturday morning. We have 2 Camp Floyd days where we have reenactors come. People think about reenacting, they think about these battle reenactments that they have between the Union soldiers and the Confederate soldiers. How do you have a reenactment when there was not a single shot fired in the Utah War? And so we do a lot of drilling and a lot of different things on our activities to show them what the soldiers did. We do a summer concert series, another activity where we may not focus on the military, but we focus on other parts of the history. On June 14th, we had our Cowboy Way of Life event where we had a covered wagon, we had a military escort wagon, and we had a stagecoach providing rides in town, besides cowboy poetry and music in the park. And so that's a way to tell some of the other history of the Cedar Valley, but it gets folks there because they want to come and ride a stagecoach. And they get to see the buildings and learn a little bit about that history that they may have never have come out before because it wasn't an interest to them. We do a Military Appreciation Day, always the second Saturday in August every year. It's a Utah State Parks event. But what we do is we do a timeline of U.S. military history from Revolutionary War on up to the present with reenactors and displays and everything. We have Junior Ranger programs, campfire programs, lantern tours, get to see the buildings at night, artisan days, learning different skills and different things. And of course, you can always find us at campfloyd.utah.gov. But those are some of the things that we do. We have, just about 8 minutes left, but I want to talk a little bit about what I'm wearing now. Because you see a lot of military uniforms and you may not know exactly what they are or what they refer to. I represent a captain in the infantry that would have been here during the Utah War at the time period at Camp Floyd. And because I represent a captain, I do not have a musket. Even though everybody wants to see the musket fire, my main defense is going to be my revolver. And so I'm usually would be in the back giving orders and telling my soldiers what to do. Now, I'm usually telling this to school kids, and I can relate to the school kids that if you are in class and you're talking and your teacher's trying to teach you a lesson, you're not able to hear because everybody's talking. Well, it'd be the same thing on the battlefield. With all the commotion and everything going on, you're not going to be able to see or hear the commands that I would give my men. And so that's the biggest reason I have my saber. The kids love to say, oh, that's for cutting people and stuff like that. This is actually a tool used to communicate with my men. And so if I'm holding it up, if I need to march and take my men off to the right to cover that flank, I can point the saber sword over to the right or to the left. If I want to march forward, I can point it. If I wanted to stop, I can bring it up. And so as my men behind me or the soldiers of the army seeing that, they know where we want to go. They know what needs to happen without me just trying to yell and give commands to them. And so we had, at Camp Floyd, we had mainly the infantry. We did have the Second Dragoons, who were underneath Colonel Philip St. George Cook, who is a name probably familiar to a lot of people in Utah history because he also led the Mormon Battalion on that largest hike in U.S. military history, the march down to the Rio Grande. And so the Dragoons, we had the 2nd Division. They were here when the Civil War was called up. You had at that point the Dragoons, the mounted riflemen, and the cavalry. The mounted riflemen would ride their horses into battle, get off their horses, go fight on foot, where the cavalry and the dragoons would fight on their horse. And so at the time of the Civil War, those three were combined into the cavalry, and the dragoons kind of vanished from military, as did the mounted riflemen. So you can imagine most of the soldiers at Camp Floyd were marching through Nevada, to Carson Valley, Nevada, up through wherever they were. And so they would set up these camps with their Sibley tents and be able to patrol from those areas. One of those famous ones where Camp Williams is today, there where Redwood Road goes up above the Jordan Narrows. And the reason the soldiers chose that location was just down the hill in the Jordan Narrows was Porter Rockwell's saloon. So what better place to have their camp where they could leave and go down the hill and get all of the drinks that they want and then stumble their way back up the hill for their night. So that was the only reason that camp was set up in that location. So I appreciate the opportunity I have to come down here and to talk to you about this. Hopefully it has been informative, and hopefully sometime you might want to come out and visit us and learn a little bit more about the site and see what Camp Floyd was through our programs and our presentations.